The wind howled across the Neva River like a wounded animal. Snow drifted through the ruins, settling on broken statues, shattered glass, and the frozen corpses of soldiers who had fallen days ago. It was September 1941, the beginning of the Siege of Leningrad. The German army had closed its iron ring around the city. Supply lines were cut. The roads to Moscow were burning. The Soviet soldiers, underfed and outgunned, dug in for what they knew would not be a battle, but a test of survival. From a bombed-out apartment window, a young woman named Anna Petrovna watched the smoke rise above the city skyline. She was not a soldier, but she had the look of one, eyes hollow, hands trembling as she held a small loaf of black bread, rationed for 3 days. Her brother, Mikhail, stood beside her, in the torn uniform of the Red Army. "Eat it," he said quietly. "I'll find more tomorrow." Anna shook her head. "You won't. Nobody will." The ring tightens. By the end of September, the German artillery had surrounded the city completely. Thousands of civilians were trapped. The only way in or out was across the frozen lake Ladoga, later called the Road of Life. Every night, German bombers came. The sound of sirens became as common as the heartbeat. Fires raged across the city, lighting up the snow with an orange glow. Hospitals were hit, bread factories were destroyed, and soon the city began to starve. Children ate wallpaper paste and sawdust bread. Cats, dogs, even rats disappeared from the streets. Yet through the hunger and the cold, the people refused to surrender. Inside the Soviet lines. At the city's edge, near the Smolensk cemetery, Soviet soldiers manned the last defensive lines. Lieutenant Ivan Morozov, commander of a T-34 tank platoon, listened to the distant explosions. His tank was frozen to the ground. Its tracks hadn't moved in days. "Comrade Lieutenant," his driver said, "we're out of diesel." Morozov sighed, rubbing his frost-bitten hands. "Then we fight without engines." They had turned the tanks into bunkers, firing positions made of steel and desperation. From his trench, Morozov could see the flickering lights of Leningrad, faint, distant, fragile. "My mother is there," he whispered. "She thinks I'm alive." Winter of death. When the winter came, it came like a curse. Temperatures dropped below -30 degrees Celsius. The rivers froze solid. The dead could not be buried. The ground was too hard. People dragged corpses into courtyards and left them there, frozen upright like statues. Anna and Mikhail lived on 125 grams of bread a day, mixed with sawdust and flour. The hunger twisted their minds. Some people began to whisper of darker things, of neighbors who disappeared, of pots boiling at night with no food in sight. One evening, Mikhail returned from the front line, carrying a frozen potato the size of his fist. He handed it to Anna like a treasure. She stared at it for a long time before whispering, "Aren't we human anymore?" Mikhail didn't answer. The city refuses to die. In December, German artillery struck the Winter Palace, shattering the great halls of the Hermitage. But amidst the destruction, a strange thing happened. The musicians of the Leningrad Philharmonic Orchestra gathered again. Under the direction of Dmitri Shostakovich, they performed the Seventh Symphony, written during the siege itself. Thin, starving men lifted violins with trembling hands. The music echoed across the city, broadcast through loudspeakers so even the soldiers at the front could hear it. And in that moment, as artillery shells burst in the distance, Leningrad sounded alive. The Germans listening through their radios were stunned. "How can they still play music?" one officer asked. His commander replied grimly, "Because we haven't broken them." Across the ocean, Thousands of miles away, in the winter of 1942, news of the siege reached America. Photographs of emaciated children and frozen streets filled the newspapers. In the barracks of the U.S. Army's 3rd Infantry Division, Private James Hall sat with his comrades reading the headline, "Leningrad, City of Hunger, holds out against Hitler." He looked up at his friend, Corporal Reed. "Can you imagine?" Hall said softly. 2 years surrounded, no food, no heat, and they're still standing? Reed shook his head. "If that happened back home, we'd never survive it." They didn't know it yet, but one day, some of those very soldiers would march through the ruins of Europe and meet the survivors of Leningrad face to face. And nothing would ever be the same. By January 1942, the city of Leningrad had turned into a silent graveyard of ice and smoke. The once proud avenues, Nevsky Prospect, Legovsky Street, Moskovsky Avenue, were buried under meters of snow and rubble. The statues of czars and poets stood half-buried, like witnesses frozen in time. But in the depths of that frozen despair, word began to spread, whispered in shelters, passed from soldier to mother, from child to starving neighbor. They've opened a road across the lake. It was called Doroga Zhizny, the road of life. The frozen lake. Lake Ladoga stretched out like a mirror of glass, endless and cruel. Under the pale winter sun, its frozen surface cracked like thunder. Temperatures fell to -40 degrees Celsius. The ice was never stable, groaning under the weight of trucks, artillery, and hope. Convoys of Zis-5 trucks began to move across the lake at night, their headlights covered with rags to avoid German bombers. Each carried sacks of flour, medical supplies, sometimes ammunition, and often children. The first driver to cross, Sergeant Nikolai Kostin, remembered the sound. "It wasn't the engines that scared us," he said later. "It was the ice. It sang like a dying man." Every mile of that lake was a gamble. If the ice cracked, the trucks vanished into the black water. Men, supplies, everything. But still they drove. Civilians in the shadows. In the starving city, Anna and Mikhail Petrovna heard the rumors too. The Red Army had opened an evacuation route, one that might lead children and the weak to safety. Mikhail insisted Anna go. She said, "You'll freeze out there." He replied, "I'll freeze here. At least on the lake, you might live." So one night she joined a line of thousands at the city's edge. Mothers clutching infants, children dragging sleds, old men wrapped in rags. The wind cut through their coats like knives. When Anna stepped onto the frozen surface, she looked back at the dark outline of Leningrad, the city she had been born in, now silent, burning, and buried in snow. Ahead, the ice groaned. Somewhere, a truck engine roared, then another. The convoy began to move. The German bombers. By dawn, the black dots appeared on the horizon. German Junkers U-88 bombers, circling like vultures. The first bombs fell near the northern shore, sending geysers of ice and water into the sky. The shockwaves shattered the surface in great cracks, swallowing men, sleds, and entire trucks. Anna dropped to the ice as explosions echoed in every direction. The air stank of fuel and frost. A soldier nearby shouted, "Keep moving! Don't stop!" Somehow she reached the far shore. Behind her, the lake burned. More than 300 people were lost that night alone. But for every life lost, the Soviets sent 10 more drivers, 10 more trucks. Each crossing meant survival for another day. Inside the convoys, the truck drivers of the road of life became legends. They were young, most barely 20, wearing scarves instead of helmets, their faces wrapped in rags against the wind. They called themselves the Ice Battalion. Every night they drove through darkness, guided only by the reflection of the moon and the red flare of distant artillery.
Sometimes they stopped to pull another driver from a crack in the ice. Sometimes they didn't stop at all. Every second mattered. When one truck broke down, they unloaded it by hand and pushed the supplies onto sleds. Bread, flour, salt. Each sack meant hundreds of lives back in Leningrad. The return journey. When the trucks reached the city, they didn't return empty. They carried out the children. Thousands of them, wrapped in blankets, silent from hunger, their faces gray like ash. One Soviet nurse wrote, "They didn't cry, not one of them. They just stared, like little ghosts." Anna watched as they loaded the children into the trucks. One small boy, no more than 6, looked up at her. "Will we see Mama again?" She smiled weakly. "Yes, you will." But she didn't believe it. Hope frozen in ice. By the end of the winter, more than 500,000 people had been evacuated across Lake Ladoga. Tens of thousands died on the way, frozen, bombed, or drowned. But the lifeline held. For the first time in months, the people of Leningrad tasted real bread. The Red Army delivered flour and medicine, and for the first time, the city dared to believe it might survive. But still, the siege was far from over. The German lines remained tight. Artillery still rained death upon the frozen streets. But now, for the first time, there was a whisper of defiance, a belief that the city would endure. Echoes from the West. In Washington, D.C., American newspapers ran headlines about the Miracle Road. Photographs showed Soviet truck drivers with frostbitten faces and eyes full of exhaustion. In American mess halls and barracks, soldiers passed those photos around in disbelief. "How are they still standing?" one Marine whispered. "They don't fight like we do. They fight like they've got nothing left to lose." For the first time, American troops realized the scale of the Soviet sacrifice and the sheer will that kept Leningrad alive. End of chapter. The ice would melt soon. When spring came, the trucks would stop, and the road of life would disappear beneath the dark waters of Lake Ladoga, leaving behind only memories, wreckage, and graves. But for now, it still held on. And in that fragile corridor of frozen water, between life and death, a city refused to die.
By the spring of 1942, Leningrad was no longer a city. It was a tomb that breathed. The snow had melted, revealing what the frost had hidden. Streets filled with bodies, horses frozen where they fell, buildings hollowed by fire and time. The smell was unbearable, the silence worse. The Germans still shelled the city every day, but fewer people ran for cover now. Fear had given way to exhaustion, and hunger. Hunger had become the only voice that mattered. Rations of dust. Every citizen carried a small, grim piece of paper, the ration card. It was the difference between life and death. Each stamp meant 125 grams of bread, if you could still call it that. The bread was black, heavy, made of anything that could stretch the flour. Sawdust, ground straw, even wallpaper paste scraped from the walls. In the bread lines, people fainted while waiting. Some never stood up again. A Soviet report from February recorded over 100,000 deaths in 1 month, almost all from starvation. Anna and Mikhail. Anna Petrovna woke each morning unsure if her brother was still alive. Mikhail had been reassigned to a Red Army unit defending the city's southern sector. He hadn't eaten a full meal in weeks. In her freezing apartment, Anna boiled wallpaper glue into soup. The smell made her gag, but she forced it down. Her hands were blue, her eyes sunken, but her spirit, though dim, refused to go out. Each day she wrote a line in her diary, her handwriting shaking. "We are still here. I do not know why."
When the bombs fell, she didn't move. There was nowhere to run. The black market of the dead. Desperation changed people. Even the most righteous learned to steal, to lie, to survive. In the alleys near Nevsky Prospect, whispers spread of a new trade: ration cards stolen from the dead. Children were sent to follow funeral carts, searching for pockets left unsearched. At night, silhouettes moved through ruined houses, taking whatever could be eaten: candle wax, books, glue, anything. There were rumors, too, rumors darker than hunger. Neighbors disappearing. Footsteps at night. Pots boiling behind closed doors. The NKVD arrested dozens, but everyone knew the truth. When food runs out, morality starves first. The soldiers' winter. On the front lines, the Red Army clung to the ruins like ghosts. Lieutenant Ivan Morozov, unit, had shrunk from 40 men to 11. They lived in frozen trenches, their boots wrapped in newspapers, their rifles rusted with frost. Every morning, the Germans shelled their position. Every night, the cold killed another man. One evening, as the sun vanished behind a wall of smoke, Morozov looked at his men and said quietly, "When this ends, we'll drink until we forget this winter." One of them laughed, another wept. The rest said nothing. Art as resistance. Even in starvation, Leningrad refused to surrender its soul. Painters, musicians, and poets continued to create, not for glory, but to remind the city it was still alive. A young poet named Olga Berggoltz broadcast daily on Radio Leningrad, her voice trembling through the static. "They will not take our city. We will not die in silence." Her words became a weapon stronger than any bullet. People tuned in just to hear her voice, proof that someone still spoke, that the city still fought. Across the Atlantic. Meanwhile, in the United States, soldiers of the 101st Airborne sat in their mess halls reading about the siege. Private James Hall, the same man who had first read of Leningrad months earlier, now looked at a photograph in Life magazine. A woman standing in snow, beside a frozen horse, holding a loaf of dark bread like treasure. He passed the photo around. "How are they still alive?" someone asked. Hall stared at it a long time. "They don't fight for victory," he said finally. "They fight because dying would mean Hitler wins." The day the river broke. In April 1942, the Neva River thawed, flooding the lower districts. The water carried bodies through the streets, soldiers, civilians, even pets long since gone. The smell of rot and oil filled the air. But with the thaw came something else: the first shipments of food brought by boat. The road of life was closed, but the lifeline remained. People lined the docks weeping as the first sacks of flour were unloaded. They would live another month, and for now, that was enough. Echoes in the dark. That summer, Mikhail returned from the front lines, thinner than ever, eyes sunken deep into his skull. He found Anna still alive, sitting by a broken window, humming a tune she could barely remember. He knelt beside her and whispered, "The Germans are pulling back." She looked up, weak but smiling. "Then maybe we will see spring again," she said. Outside, the city groaned, but it was still breathing. End of Chapter 3. By the end of 1942, nearly 1 million people had died in Leningrad. Yet the city still stood. The red banner still flew above its ruined skyline. The people who survived were no longer the same. Thinner, colder, quieter, but unbroken. And as American troops followed the headlines, they realized something profound. The Soviets weren't merely defending a city. They were defending the very idea of endurance itself.